Good day, everybody. I am Jensen Ramos Abajo, and I am one of your discussants for today. And for today's presentation, we are going to explore and learn about the character of Korean literature by studying Korea's classical and modern literature. So, without further ado, let's get started. Korean literature is usually divided chronologically into a classical and a modern period, but the basis for such a division is still being questioned. Great reforms swept Korea after the mid 19th century as its society actively absorbed Western things. Korea's classical literature developed against the backdrop of traditional folk beliefs of the Korean people. It was also developed and influenced by Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. Among these, Buddhist influence held the greatest sway, followed by enormous influences from Confucianism, especially Song Confucianism, and this is during the Joseon period. Modern literature of Korea, on the other hand, developed out of its contact with Western culture. Following the course of modernization, not only Christian thought, but also various artistic trends and influences were imported from the West. As the new education and national language and literature movement developed, the Chinese writing system, which had traditionally represented the culture of the dominant class, lost the socio-cultural function it had previously enjoyed. At the same time, the Korean script, Hangul, was being used more and more frequently, resulting in the growth of development of Korean language and literature studies. With the advent of the new novel, which is Shinsosul, came a surge in novels written in the Korean script. Music and classical poetry, formerly fused together in a kind of a song called Changgok, were now viewed as separate endeavors. New paths opened for the new literature. While Korea was importing Western culture via Japan or China, it was also carrying out literary forms from within. Linguistic expression and manner of transmission are issues of utmost importance in the overall understanding of Korean literature. Korean literature extends over a broad territory. Literature recorded in Chinese and literature written in Hangul. These two aspects of Korean literature greatly differ from each other in terms of their literary forms and character. Korean literature in Chinese was created when Chinese characters were brought to Korea. Because Chinese characters are a Chinese invention, there have been times in Korea's history when efforts were made to exclude literature written in Chinese from the parameters of what constitutes Korean literature. But in the Koryo and Joseon cultures, Chinese letters were central to Koreans' daily lives. We also cannot overlook the fact that the literary activity of the dominant class was conducted in Chinese. While Chinese-centered ideas and values are contained in this literature, a feature shared by most of East Asia during this period. They also contain experiences and thought patterns that express the unique way of life of the Korean people. The use of the Korean script began during the Joseon period with the creation of the Korean alphabet. The creation of the Korean alphabet in the 15th century was a crucial turning point in Korea's literary history. Compared with the literature written in Chinese, which was dominated by the upper classes, Korean script made possible by the broadening of the literary field to include women and commoners. This expanded the social base of Korean writers and readers alike. The Korean script, which is the Hangul, assumed its place of leading importance in Korean literature only during the latter half of the 19th century. After the Enlightenment period, the use of Chinese letters swiftly declined and the popularity of Korean letters greatly increased. As soon as the linguistic duality of Chinese and native within Korean life was overcome, literature in the Korean script became the foundation upon which national literature was developed. Now let us have Korea's classical literature. First, we have Hyangga from the Shilla period. The Hyangga poetry of the Shilla period signaled the beginning of a unique poetic form in Korean literature. The Hyangga were recorded in the Hangul script, in which the Korean language was written using sound and meaning of Chinese characters. 14 poems in the Hyangga style from the Shilla period have been preserved in the Samguk-yusa, or memorabilia of the Three Kingdoms. It is difficult to make general determinations about the personalities of the Hyangga poets, but it is thought that the four-line poems, with their ballad-like attributes, may indicate that the poets came from a broad range of backgrounds. And second, we have the Koryo Kayo or Koryo songs. The literature of the Koryo period is marked by an increased use of Chinese letters, the disappearance of Hyangga, and emergence of Koryo Kayo, which continued to be transmitted as oral literature until the Joseon period. The transmission of the Hyangga literature of Shilla was continued until the early part of Koryo, but as in the 11 verses of Kunyo's Poyens Chipchung Wonwanga, or the songs of the 10 vows of Samantabra. These were mostly religious prayers with no secular or artistic flavor. The new poetic form introduced by writers of the Koryo period was the Koryo Kayo called Byolgok. The identities of most of the Koryo Kayo authors are unknown. These songs were only transmitted only later in the Joseon period, where they recorded using the Korean script Hangul. The Koryo Kayo are characterized by increased length and a free and undisciplined form. The bold, direct nature of the songs make them distinctive. They deal with the real world of humankind, but because the songs were transmitted orally over a long period and recorded only after the beginning of the Joseon period, there is a strong possibility that they have been partially altered. The third classical literature is the Shijo and Kasa. The creation of Korean alphabet in the early Joseon period was one of the turning points in the history of Korean literature. In the process of creating the Korean alphabet, which is the Hangul, and investigating its practically akchang, which is the musical scores, were written in the Korean script, such as Yongbyoch Bonga. It is a song of flying dragons through the heavens, which celebrates the foundation of the Joseon dynasty from 1992 to 1910, and which is complete with musical notation and instrumentation. The Shijo is representative of Joseon period poetry. Its poetic form was established in the late Koryo period, but it flourished to a greater extent under the Joseon period's new leading ideology, Song Neo-Confucianism, and the fact that a majority of the Shijo poets were well versed in Confucianism, and that these poems of the late Koryo and early Joseon periods, for the most part, dealt with the theme of loyalty, help us to understand the historical function of the Shijo. Now let's have the modern literature of Korea. The literature of the Enlightenment period. Korean modern literature was formed against the background of the crumbling feudalistic society of the Joseon dynasty. The importance of new ideas from the West and the new political realistic of rising Japanese imperial power in East Asia. The first stage in the establishment of Korea's modern literature extends from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century, and it is designated as the literature of Enlightenment period. The change from traditional to modern literature during the Enlightenment period was largely due to the effects of the new education and the Korean language and literature movement. After the Kabo reforms of 1894, a new brand of education was enforced. New Western-style schools were established, and new textbooks for teaching Western knowledge were published. The literature of the Enlightenment period secured its social base through newly emerged media like newspapers. Literature of the Japanese colonial period. Korea suffered a great deal under Japanese colonial rule from 1910 to 1945, coercing the Korean government to conclude the Korean-Japanese Annexation Treaty. Japan then installed a governor-general in Korea and enforced military rule. Restrictions governing speech and publications were especially severe. As a result, Korea's spirit of self-reliance and independence, together with its will to proceed with the Enlightenment ideas, no longer could find expression in its literature. The Korean literature of the Japanese colonial period began with the March 1st independence movement of 1919. It was during this period that the Korean people began to exhibit a more positive attitude in coping with their national situation. Strengthened by feelings of national self-awakening which had been stirred up by the March 1st independence movement of 1919. The literature of that period began to show an interest in themes of self-discovery and individual expression, as well as an increased interest in concrete reality. Literature of the period of national division. After the liberation from the Japanese in 1945, Korea became embroiled in the political maneuvers of the world powers, and the division into South and North became unavoidable. This division in political thought also made a significant impact on the literary world, as the factionalism and struggles began to occur between Southern and Northern literatures. The Korean War of 1950 to 1953 was a tragic interim which solidified Korea's division into South and North. Post-war Korean society's emergence from the wounds and chaos of that war had a considerable impact on the development of Korean literature. The translation of Korean literature in foreign languages. Korean literature was largely unknown to the world until the 1980s, when translations of Korean literary work began to appear in foreign countries. Since then, the types of work selected for translation have become increasingly diverse, and the quality of the translations themselves have improved steadily. Furthermore, as the translations principally are being published by overseas publishers, the translations have become available to a wider reading public. Since the 1980s, Korean literature in English translation has spread widely in the English-speaking countries. Anthologies of Korean modern short stories such as Flowers of Fire of Peter H. Lee from University of Hawaii Press 1974 and Land of Exile of Marshall R. Phil and Bruce Fulton of New York 1993 are widely used as textbooks in universities all across the English-speaking world. And that will be all for my report. Once again, my name is Jensen Ramos Abajo. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.